Hey everyone. So let's talk a little AncestryDNA today. I'm one of those people that gets asked a lot, where are you from? What's your nationality? And I don't mind that because I'm the sort of person that asks other people where they're from. I've always had an interest in ethnicity. Now, when people approach me and ask me that question, usually they're assuming that I'm from somewhere on the Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Burma even. And when I give them my stock standard response, no, I'm black, American, with some Irish and Native American mixed in, they're always surprised by that. Wow, I didn't see that coming. And the reason that I give that particular response is that it's very much in keeping with our family narrative of what our background is. Every family has its own narrative, its own story about its ancestry. And sometimes those stories are incredibly spot on and accurate and have sort of been meticulously maintained through the generations. And sometimes they're just full of myth and inaccuracy and exaggeration. So I thought, well, why don't I put my own family narrative to the test and submit my DNA for analysis? So when I did my research on this and looked into the two major DNA companies, AncestryDNA and 23andMe, I couldn't really find a way to distinguish between one or the other. They both seemed equally professional, equally competent, equally good. So I decided to submit my DNA to both companies. I figured, well, not only will I get more information back, because I had no expectation that they would produce identical results, but nonetheless, I assumed that there would be a significant correlation, a significant overlap between both results. And finally, I'd get to decide which was the better company, which company I thought produced the better product. So I sent my DNA off to both companies on the same day. And if you had asked me on that day, well, what do you think your results are going to be? I would have said to you, well, I'm going to be 60% African, 30% European, and 10% Native American. But after making that prediction, a funny thing happened. I began to watch other people's DNA videos on YouTube, of which there are many. And as I watched more and more, I became a better predictor of what their results were going to be. And it caused me to change my own prediction. I lowered my African prediction from 60% to 50%. I bumped up my European prediction from 30% to 40%. And I completely did away with my Native American prediction, because by that time I had come to realize that virtually every family that believes they have Native American ancestry exaggerates it greatly. There seems to be a universal impulse to exaggerate your Indian heritage. And I decided I would do away with that expectation altogether. So my final prediction was 50 Afro, 40 Euro, and 10% unspecified. So before I post my results, let's take a look at my ancestors first. Okay, so these are my relatives, circa 100 years ago. This dignified-looking chap here is my great-grandfather, Edward Lawrence, and he is married to this woman here, Eliza Shrewsbury, and this is their daughter, Edith. Edith was my grandmother. Great-looking picture here. Now, this is a larger group of relatives, around 12 years later. You see Edward has aged quite a bit in that time, his wife Eliza. And my grandmother now is not only married, but has 3 kids. Gwen, Frank, and this little kid here is my mother. This chap standing in the middle here is Benjamin Franklin Murphy, my grandfather. Now, the interesting thing about this picture for me, what jumps out for me, is that all of these relatives of mine were very self-identified as black, as African American, or in the parlance of that era, colored. But you can see from the photo just how much European representation there is within the family at that point. It's a really striking, really interesting photo. This was shot around 1922. Another picture of my grandmother, Edith. Of course, I never knew her at this young age. Very elegant looking there. Another picture of my great-grandfather. He looks like some sort of dashing Hollywood actor in that picture. Okay, so that's the extended family going back many years. What about my immediate family? Okay, so here's my immediate family. Father, mother, sister, brother. And this little kick-ass guy in the front row there holding the truck, that's me. Now, we happened to be traveling through India at that time. Produced this interesting archival photo. And here is the last photo. This is a picture of my dad and I. We're just kind of hanging out at a sauna in Helsinki, Finland. Yeah, we got around quite a bit back in those days. I'm about 10 years old in that picture. Okay, so we've heard the family narrative. We've seen the family photos. And you've gotten my prediction. So now, let's see what the science says. So my 23andMe results came back first. They beat AncestryDNA by about a week. So let's take a look. Okay, so here we are at 23andMe. One of the first things I have to say about it is I like the interface here. It's very clear. It's very understandable. Jeffrey Rowan, here's the full ancestral pie that we're looking at. And as I scroll down, we see the results. And the bird's eye view of the results are these. My ancestry is 52.7% European. It is 45.7% African. And by sub-Saharan African, they mean that part of Africa that is below the Sahara Desert. I've got 1.2% Asian and Native American. There is a little Native American in there, not of the sort that I had originally thought. And they actually couldn't assign 0.5% of my DNA. So I would say that my prediction was a pretty good one. I had said 50 African, 40 European, and they are somewhat reversed, but I was pretty much in the ballpark there. But the question is, what about the specifics? What about this Irish connection I've been talking about? So let's take a look at my European ancestry. Of that 53%, around 35% of it is Northwestern European. And as you look at the specifics, about 16.5% is British and Irish. But it's important to go down here and look at this number. Broadly Northwestern European. What that means is that 17.5% of my DNA can be found in Northwest Europe, but not in a manner where they can assign a particular country to it. When they use the phrase Northwestern European, they're referring to Ireland, the UK, France, Germany, the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Scandinavia. And so my DNA is generally found in those countries, and those countries alone. But they can't, at this point, tell me which one. So one of the surprises of the DNA results is that I have Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. And the Ashkenazi Jews were the Jewish communities that settled in Germany and Poland and Russia and the Ukraine and Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and primarily spoke Yiddish through the early part of the 20th century. And interestingly, if you scroll down, it'll give you a timeline of where the various ethnicities entered your lineage. And so let's take a look. You most likely had a great-grandparent, second great-grandparent, or third great-grandparent who was 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. This person was likely born between 1800 and 1860. How cool is that? And it shows you when the various ethnic groups entered your ancestry. You can see that the West African entry is around the time of that you would expect, around the time of African slavery, all the way back to a long-lost Southeast Asian relative, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, that goes back to the 1680s. Very, very cool. Now, I have Southern European ancestry that takes into account the Mediterranean countries, and I have a category that's broadly European, where again, they can't specify which countries that would involve. My European ancestry is far more spread out through Europe, far more far-flung than the family narrative ever would have thought or suggested. Okay, so let's go to Africa. Okay, so as I indicated before, my ancestry is all sub-Saharan, all below the Sahara Desert. And West African applies to those countries from at the north, Senegal, going as far south as Nigeria. And that takes into account Gambia, Ghana, Sierra Leone, many of the main slave ports that existed on the west coast of Africa. So almost all of my DNA is clustered within that West African zone, even though there are some small elements of my ancestry that are from South Africa and Central Africa. Now, this makes perfect sense to me, since the nations that seem to be the homeland of my ancestors were right around the major African slave ports. And speaking of slavery, I have some thoughts about the slave trade that I'd like to share right now. This will take a few minutes, and so anybody who isn't really interested in a non-DNA discussion about the African slave trade, I will post below where you can jump to, and you can skip over this discussion, and I'll meet you there in about 4 minutes. Now, the interesting thing about the African slave trade is that even though in the United States we tend to look at it through a U.S. lens, understandably because slavery was such a profound and destructive force in U.S. history, when you look at American slavery in the context of the entirety of African slavery, only 4 to 5% of all slaves found their way to the U.S. colonies. That is, 95% of all slaves went elsewhere other than the United States. And I'd like to spell out some of the reasons why that happened. At that time, the biggest, most aggressive, persistent slaving country in the world was Portugal. That's right, Portugal. I bet you wouldn't have picked Portugal. Portugal started before all the other European countries got into the act, and they tended to hang on to slavery, at least in their colonies, long after other European countries had given it up. Now, in the 1500s, the Portuguese were in the process of colonizing Brazil, and they found themselves sitting on the most valuable farm crop in the world at that time, sugarcane. Sugar was such a valued commodity that the British referred to it at the time as white gold. The problem with sugarcane was it was an extremely labor-intensive crop to farm. You needed people to plant, to harvest, to process, to turn it into its various food products, molasses, rum, syrup, table sugar. You needed to package it, you needed to ship it, you needed a large workforce for your sugar commerce. Now, what the Portuguese tried to do initially was they tried to force the indigenous people, the Amerindians, to do that work for them. And it was a complete failure for one basic reason. The Amerindians had no physical defenses against the diseases that the Europeans brought over. That is, bubonic plague, smallpox, measles, mumps, influenza, typhus. Those diseases essentially wiped out the Amerindian populations. There was such a high level of morbidity and mortality that they were a completely unreliable workforce. So the Portuguese had to go looking elsewhere for their workers. And they went to Africa. And they realized that they could forcibly transport African slaves to the Americas to do that work. And thus began what the historians call the African slave trade triangle. The Portuguese would go to Africa, where they would secure large numbers of slaves and forcibly transport them to ports like Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, Recife. They would put those slaves to work in the fields and produce the sugar food products, molasses, rum, syrup. Those products would then get sent to Europe and fetch a fabulous profit. A small part of that profit would then get reinvested in the form of firearms, gunpowder, alcohol, copper bracelets, metallic trinkets of various sorts. And those would then get sent back to Africa and traded to the indigenous slavers for more African slaves. And the cycle would repeat all over again. So at the end of the day, virtually half of all slaves, 45 to 50% of the 11 million people who survived the Middle Passage, went to Brazil. Almost half of all slaves went to one country, Brazil. Now, where did the other half go? Well, they went to the West Indies/Caribbean. So Jamaica had twice as many slaves as the United States. Barbados had exactly the same number of slaves as the United States. Only 450,000 of the 11 million slaves found their way to the United States. So I might add that those of us who now constitute the 42 million African Americans in the United States are largely descended from that original group of 450,000. Now, there was one other basic reason why so few, relatively few, slaves came to the United States. It was too far. The slavers had no morality. They had no particular compassion for their human cargo. But they did understand the concept of profit. And they knew that the longer the trip went on, the more people would die. And every time somebody died, that was lost profit. So why make your way all the way to Charleston, South Carolina, which, by the way, was the #1 slave port, when you could just drop people off in Jamaica or the Cayman Islands or the Bahamas or Barbuda? That was just as profitable. So that's what they did. Now, one final interesting fact about the slave trade. Many historians believe that one of the contributing factors to the British losing the Revolutionary War against the American colonies was their participation in the slave trade. What happened was the British had many colonies where the slaves outnumbered the European populations in those islands. And so they had to commit a certain amount of military force to pacify the slaves. The slaves were always on the verge of revolt. So they had to commit military forces there, forces that otherwise would have been used against the American colonies. Interesting thought. Okay, sorry for that little historical detour there. Let's get back to my AncestryDNA results and how they compare with 23andMe. Okay, so here we have my AncestryDNA results. And when you look at it in broad brush, the results look very similar to 23andMe. We've got Europe, 51%. We've got Africa, 48%. Very similar to the 23andMe results. But when you start drilling down and look at the specifics of the AncestryDNA findings, they start to differ significantly from 23andMe. Let's take a look. Let's start with Europe. The first thing that's striking about my European results is that the number one area that they assigned to my ancestry is Scandinavia. Now, Scandinavia basically got no play whatsoever in the 23andMe results. But you have to remember that 23andMe category of broadly Northwestern European. Well, that encompassed Scandinavia. Remember, 23andMe said we can't assign that to any particular country or area. Well, my guess is that what happened was AncestryDNA looked at that same DNA based on their formulae and said we can assign it to an area. And they assigned it to Scandinavia, which is, I mean, there's a wow aspect to that because it certainly doesn't conform to any family narrative I've ever heard. So 16% Scandinavia. They also give a much higher amount of percentage to my Iberian roots, Portuguese and Spanish. 16% Scandinavia, 13% Iberian Peninsula. They do agree with 23andMe about my Irish ancestry. It's a little higher in 23andMe. They also agree with the Ashkenazi Jewish heritage that was assigned to me by 23andMe. So those things are in agreement, but there's a certain amount of disagreement between the two companies. Okay, so let's move to Africa. And here's where things really start to unravel. Recall that in 23andMe, virtually all of my DNA was found in Western Africa, between the nations of Senegal and Nigeria. But AncestryDNA says, au contraire, the biggest block of DNA that we have for you is found in southeastern Africa. And you can see the nations: South Africa, Kenya, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Angola, Uganda. Well, it's in total disagreement with 23andMe on this issue. As we move up the West Coast, we find Benin and Togo get some play at 13%. So we are moving toward Western Africa there. And the Cameroon is just below Western Africa. And then we see small amounts in Nigeria, Mali, Ivory Coast, Ghana. Those would be Western Africa, but they are given secondary status by AncestryDNA, whereas they get primary status in 23andMe. So that's a very, very different result. And it leaves me very confused because there is no way to really reconcile the findings of the two companies. I know in the main how much African ancestry I have, but where exactly it comes from, there's no way of telling. Now, I might mention that recently I sent off another DNA sample to a company called Family Tree DNA. And what they do with your DNA is they break it down and separate the DNA that comes from your mother and the DNA that comes from your father, and they trace those two lineages individually. So who knows? They may shed some light on this, and they may constitute a tiebreaker sometime down the line. I hope so. So what exactly have I learned from this exercise? Well, I've learned that my family story, my family narrative, is pretty much on point. What about the Irish connection? I've learned that there is a significant Irish connection in my ancestry. But actually, the family narrative didn't know the half of it in terms of my European background. There is a broad European background that I have. It could be French, could be German, could be Belgian, that can't really be pinpointed at this time. I've learned that not only am I part of the broad African diaspora, in which Africans were forcibly dispersed all over the Americas, I'm also part of the Jewish diaspora, in which Jews, as a result of persecution, were dispersed all over the world. And let's not forget that AncestryDNA attributed 16% of my ancestry to Scandinavia. So according to them, I'm a Viking, a Norseman. Now, as far as my African roots go, I'm left with nothing but confusion, since the two companies could not agree with each other. But that simply points up the fact that this is a young and evolving technology. And those differences between 23andMe and AncestryDNA may get sorted out over the next few years as the DNA technology becomes more sophisticated, more precise. And how would I compare the two companies? Well, for me, the 23andMe results seem to hang together a little better. If I could only have the result from one company, it would be 23andMe. But I can't prove that they're any better than those of AncestryDNA, just my sense. Now, has there been any downside to this exercise? Well, the only one that I can think of is that when somebody now approaches me and says, "Hey, where are you from?" I may have to turn to them and say, "Never mind, if I told you, we'd be here all day." I'm Jeff Rowan. Thanks for watching.